You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher.
Today we're at the Australian War Memorial's Conservation Annex out at a suburb called Mitchell, and we're here to look at some First and Second World War sweetheart jewellery.
Sweetheart jewellery. It conjures up such a gorgeous image of love and beautiful objects. Brooches, lockets, pendants, bracelets and rings, given to a loved one gone to war or one who stayed home. But these love tokens weren't always exchanged by actual sweethearts. Diane Rutherford is a curator of military heraldry and technology.
Sweetheart jewellery, it's a little bit of a misnomer. It implies that it's jewellery that's given to wives or girlfriends or fiancés, but in actual fact it's jewellery that was given usually by a service person to a friend or a relative to help remember them by, to commemorate their service, sometimes to commemorate a loss. So these are the three
Diane has assembled a collection of sweetheart jewellery to show me, pieces that are not currently on display at the memorial.
This one's a bit different, unfortunately, from all.
Some of these items are made from precious metals, others from natural found objects, some from bits of crashed aircraft. We've invited conservator George Bailey along to talk about how these objects are cared for. And we start with a tiny gold brooch from the First World War.
So this is a lovely little gold brooch made in 1914, and it's got a gold boomerang with Australia on it, and above that is a little disc with a gold feature of a soldier wearing a peak cap and carrying a rifle.
Was this a unique piece? Was this made as an individual item, do you know, or was it part of a series of similar brooches?
The elements were commercially available. This was made by a jeweller, and the soldier features often on gold watch fobs that were presented to soldiers either going to the war or when they've returned home.
So what's the story with this particular brooch?
This brooch was given to Mrs. Eliza Ryan by her son John, who enlisted in the AIF in 1914 before he embarked to go overseas. And he gave it to her as something to wear with pride, to remember him by. One of the things that's interesting about it is that with the boomerang, it was quite popular during both world wars as a symbol both of patriotism, but also of that idea of the boomerang returning. So I go to return is often a motto you'll see on some sweetheart jewellery. Unfortunately, in this situation, that wasn't the case. John doesn't return from the war.
So this item becomes even more poignant for his mum.
It becomes very special for his mother. One of the things that's a little bit interesting too is that the soldier in this is wearing a peaked cap, not a slouch hat, which of course is very famous for the AIF. And the reason I find it really interesting is because he landed at Gallipoli on the 26th of April, 1915, with C Company 15th Battalion. The 15th Battalion lands late on the 25th, but the C Company doesn't land until the next day. And they're actually wearing peak caps. They're not wearing slouch hats that day.
But he wouldn't have known that when he selected that brooch for his mother.
No, he wouldn't have. It was just a sort of a standard image, but it's just quite amazing how that's his actual war experience, is wearing that uniform.
It turns out that the men were ordered to wear the peaked caps rather than their slouch hats, so they'd be less conspicuous to the enemy. But it didn't help John. He was wounded in the face the day he landed, evacuated to a hospital in Alexandria, and died less than a week later. I wonder if John's mum wore his brooch after his death.
We don't know. She certainly did keep it as a treasure. She had 4 sons that enlisted and 3 served overseas. And so she lost John during the war, and another son, George, died in 1921 due to his war service.
Let's bring in George Bailey now. George is a senior objects conservator here at the memorial. What goes into caring for a precious piece of gold jewellery such as this?
Gold's actually fairly easy to look after. It's one of the more noble metals, so we don't usually have corrosion problems with gold. Depending on its purity, some of the lower carat golds do tend to tarnish, and so we would usually clean that off, something like that, the tarnish off, and lacquer it with a special lacquer to stop it tarnishing again. But if it's a high purity, high carat gold, we probably wouldn't do much with it at all. We wouldn't need to.
Obviously it's not on display at the moment, so how is it stored?
We would wrap it up in tissue paper to protect it from from pollutants and dust and things like that, and it'd be packed away in a box safely on shelf.
The next piece of jewellery Diane has to show me is also from the First World War. Di, what about this beautiful little piece here that looks as though it's made out of mother of pearl, and it's a bird, quite a large bird, and I can't really tell what sort, and there's some writing underneath it as well. Can you describe that better than I can?
Yeah. This is an absolutely exquisite hand-carved mother-of-pearl brooch made in Palestine, probably in Bethlehem, where they've had an industry for hundreds of years. After the capture of the area in 1917, all these beautiful brooches were available to Australian soldiers. This one's a beautiful hand-carved brooch of the unofficial Six Life Horse badge. So it has a bird on it, a bustard, and the number 6, and little inscription underneath.
So what does the inscription say? Let's have a look.
LH Reg, so Light Horse Regiment, AIF, and then underneath that it says fight on, fight ever, which was their motto.
And that inscription is so small, it's really hard to read, even with my glasses on, so I can't imagine the skill it must have taken to carve it.
You're looking at centuries of skill in the carving of these items. It's absolutely exquisite.
So an Australian soldier would have asked a local craftsman to make this. Do we know any more about who that person might have been?
His name was Private Conrick. He served with the Six Light Horse during the First World War, and yes, he would have paid to have this specially made. This isn't your standard souvenir.
And sent to a sweetheart or a mother or a sister, we don't know?
Sent to someone in his family, yeah, and I'm sure they would have absolutely loved it. It's one of the most exquisite carved badges I've seen.
And how would you look after this piece, George?
Being mother of pearl, so it's a carbonate, so we would keep it away from acidic conditions, so, in acid-free cardboard and steel shelving. So we certainly wouldn't recommend storing something like that in a wooden filing cabinet or anything like that. So wood exudes organic acids and organic acids and shell-like material don't go together.
How strong is mother of pearl? I mean, do you have to be careful when you're handling it?
Reasonably so. It's not that brittle. It's actually reasonably strong. It's from oyster shells and things like that, so it is reasonably strong. But like everything here, we handle everything carefully.
They certainly do. Diane very carefully unwraps the next precious object. It's an inscribed silver bracelet.
What this is a silver privately purchased identity bracelet, and what it's got at the top is an RAAF pilot's wings enamelled with blue and red, and then underneath it says AUS, so Australia, and then 6068 RAL SN. And it's an identity bracelet for Stanley Rowell, who was a member of the Royal Australian Air Force. This one's an unusual piece of sweetheart jewellery in that normally it's given to a family member of a person serving. This one's the other way round. This was given to Stan by his fiancée, Marion, for his 23rd birthday in 1944.
Stan was from Brisbane. He'd arrived in Canada for training in late 1943. Marion was Canadian, but not much is known about her, not even her surname. In March 1944, not long after his birthday, Stan was killed, along with another student pilot, when their planes collided during a training exercise. The bracelet was eventually returned to Stan's family and recently donated to the memorial by one of his nieces.
It's reasonably rare to have a piece of jewellery given to a service person rather than the other way around, but it was a way of linking Marion and Stan so that they would be together while he was serving. Once he had finished his training, he likely would have gone to Europe to fight.
And so she knew that, and that's why she gave this to him, because it would be a little piece of her that he was always wearing, hopefully.
Yeah, something to remember her by, something to keep them linked while he was away.
And George, what about the care of this item?
This one would probably require a bit more care than the previous one we spoke about. I mean, you can see the tarnish there on the back. So silver does tarnish a lot more readily than gold. But having said that, tarnish is not damaging in any way. It is quite stable, and if we left that alone, it wouldn't get any worse in our storage conditions.
So the tarnish just affects the look, it doesn't affect the quality?
Exactly. Were we to put this on display, we probably would polish it up, take the tarnish off, because that's the way it would appear when he was wearing it. You know, I'm assuming he would have looked after it and kept it nice and shiny and silver rather than black.
Just going back to you, Di, were these type of name bracelets common during the war, or did she have this one specially made for him?
They were reasonably common. You could buy them at jewellers. So this is made by a company called the Electrical Chain Company in Canada. And you can buy them with whichever little decoration was relevant to the service the person was in, and then get the engraving done. Wearing a bracelet was quite popular because they wore their normal identity discs around their neck.
And they were allowed to wear the bracelet?
They could wear the bracelet. You couldn't really see them under the uniform.
And what does the engraving say again? Can you explain what it says?
The engraving says AUS 6068 RAL SN. So the AUS is for Australian. That's actually a Canadian thing. We didn't tend to put nationality on our identity discs or bracelets. 6068 is his service number, and then his surname and given initials.
You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. We're going to stay with sweetheart jewellery from the Second World War, but the next pieces are very unusual. They were made by serving defence personnel in their free time, using materials that were readily available.
This one is a handmade piece of sweetheart jewellery, so not a commercially available item. And it was made in Papua New Guinea during the Second World War, and it's a shell necklace with dozens of shells held together by small chains made out of stainless steel wire.
This is a necklace that would have taken a great deal of time and patience to make, from collecting the right type and number of shells to working out how to string them together.
At the back, the wire is held in place within the shells through the use of cut up small pieces of plaster of Paris bandages.
Wow, that's using what's to hand, isn't it?
It is indeed, and it's and even all these years later, 70, 80 years later, it's still actually in quite good condition considering.
It's really lovely, isn't it? Because you've got a long necklace, and right at the base there are two little shells that drop down to give it a pendant effect. It really is quite special. It's
very special, and the man who made it, Ned Newman, he went to a lot of effort to try and match up the colours and the sizes of the shells so that they would look good if you wore them.
So who was Ned Newman, and who did he make this exquisite necklace for?
He was a member of the 11th Field Ambulance. He served in Papua New Guinea and then in Bougainville. And he made this for Ruth Laurie, who he was introduced to before he went overseas by his sister. And they became pen friends. And through the war, they wrote to each other, and he would make her jewellery out of the local shells and send it home.
Do you know how many pieces he made for her?
No, he made at least 3 that we're aware of, but he may have made more.
So was this a common pastime for soldiers when they had downtime?
It is a fairly common pastime, and you actually saw the development in some instances of small, almost like cottage industries, where they would make and sell pieces of trench art, essentially, such as this. So it was a reasonably common practice, but it was very time-consuming.
George, how do you look after a handmade shell necklace?
Very carefully. Storage conditions are particularly important for things like shells. Certain timbers give off organic acids, which will dissolve the shells. Fortunately, we don't have any wooden shelving storage areas, so we're good in that respect. But, you know, whoever owned this before the War Memorial, before they gave it to the War Memorial, obviously had it in a good storage, because the shells, 70 years later, are still quite shiny. I've seen examples of this kind of stuff where it's almost powder. They've been that corroded by the the organic acid. So, this one's in really good condition, and we aim to keep it that way.
So Ruth obviously treasured this item, Di.
She did, and she hung on to it throughout her life. She remained in contact with Ned and then also Ned's wife Dorothy after the war.
Hold on, so she and Ned didn't get together after the war?
They didn't. They did meet once, but there were no sparks and they remained friends. But she remained in contact with the family, and then later in life, when she had cancer, she actually sent it back to the family to keep.
So you mentioned that Ned wrote to Ruth when he sent her the jewellery that he made, and these letters are quite detailed, aren't they?
They are. We have one in the collection, a 20-page letter that he wrote to Ruth.
20 pages.
20 pages, and he goes into quite some detail in the letter about how he made the shell necklaces for her.
Ned would get up before dawn and take a small boat to a particular beach where he'd look for shells under rocks at low tide. There's a lot of detail about drying out the shells and burying them in sand to kill the creatures inside. This process involves maggots, Dettol and thin wire, then polishing the shells with cotton wool. We're not going to hear all that though, it goes on for pages. But I've asked curator Shane Casey to read a bit from the letter so we can get an idea of the kind of man Ned was. The letter was sent separate to the parcel that contained the necklace.
Have you received the souvenir I sent you yet, Ruth? Hope they arrive in good condition, as I don't think they would stand too much rough treatment. Besides, I would like you to get them in good order to see what you think of the job I made of them. I hope you will say I'm a clever little boy. Sorry I was not able to enclose a note to explain how they are made, etc., but we're not allowed to enclose a note in anything, bar an envelope, but of course you understand. I don't know if you've seen strings of shells made up like that before. If so, they won't be so much of a novelty as otherwise, Ruth, and as I've said before, I heard the Yanks were also buying them off the Aussies and sending them to the Aussie girls, saying they made them themselves. They would. The shells themselves aren't extra valuable, but made into souvenirs, I've seen certain coloured ones that bring 5 guineas. I was offered £3 for that pale blue coloured string I sent you, Ruth, but just like the baskets, anything I make specially for you is certainly not for sale. Sometimes the lads in my tent tell me I'm nuts for not selling different odds and ends when someone puts a generous price on them, but somehow I've never valued dough very much. Guess someday when I'll be scratching for it, I won't be able to knock up a square quid or two quite so easy. Still, as I am not extravagant, I guess I'll be able to live after the war without a fortune in the bank. Still, I think it's mostly having responsibilities that makes a lot of men want to make money out of everything they can get their hands on. But I think that often leads to the more you want, right? Sometimes leads to making a bloke too tight, right? Yes, I guess so. You know, that's one reason I decided to be a bachelor. No responsibilities, no worries, no etc. Guess you think that's only one side of the business, eh, Ruth? Still, I'll always admit that there is generally 2 sides to any argument, so I guess it's a matter of opinion, eh? Gosh, I'm a tiger for getting off the subject, aren't I?
Di, that's such a lovely, chatty, detailed letter, and as you say, it goes on for another 19 or so pages.
Yeah, it's a wonderful letter.
He also talks in that letter about making a basket for her. Do we know what happened to the basket?
No idea what happened to the basket.
We do know what happened to Ned, though. Despite his professed bachelorhood in his letter to Ruth, he also married just after the war and had 6 children. He and his wife Dorothy were together for more than 56 years. Ned died in 2005. One of the most popular types of jewellery handmade by servicemen in the Second World War was fashioned from perspex.
Oh, George, let's just set these out here so we can have a look at them.
Sure.
Oh, that's a really lovely perspex collection, isn't it?
Yeah.
Perspex, or acrylic glass, was a relatively new material. Its first commercial application was in the late 1930s. Most of the dozens of pieces of perspex jewellery in the memorials collection appear to have been made in the southwest Pacific. So where did the men get it?
From damaged aircraft, either Allied aircraft that had crashed or been damaged, or enemy aircraft, so usually Japanese.
So how do they make them? I mean, I'm looking at one here and it's a diamond shape and it's red perspex with what looks like a silver cross inside. There's another piece here that's clear perspex with what looks like gold wings. And then there's this beautiful blue heart with, I can't really tell what's inside that piece of perspex.
So all of them, the perspex is clear for all of them. What they did was they managed to get their hands on paint. Where they got it from, we don't know. But what they would do is they would cut up a piece of perspex, a small piece, and then they would shape it how they would like it. The ones with the eagles and with the cross, they would actually impress, they would heat up and impress an item into the back of it, and then they would paint infill the back of the piece of perspex. And to get the shape and the polish, they would polish it down, maybe with a bit of sand and some wet cloth, whatever they could get their hands on.
Sometimes the men would scratch images or engrave words into the back of the perspex, then highlight the markings with gold-coloured paint. Sometimes they'd embed pieces of coins, badges, even diamantes into the heated perspex and leave them in there. The most popular shapes were ovals and hearts. Often a pin was attached to the back to make a brooch, but the men also made pendants and bracelets. One, Di shows me, is made of a string of tiny hearts.
Yes, which is particularly delicate work to get hearts that small. And the amount of polishing it would have taken hours to finish that one.
But, you know, these are airmen who had a lot of downtime and needed something to fill that time before they went on their missions.
Yes, and it also was something that the ground crew could do. They had access to the equipment. And so, yeah, it was something that you could spend time doing. You could send something home as a gift to a loved one for them to remember you by and to share in your experiences. And it filled in time, certainly.
I like this kit. It shows all the various stages of the manufacture of those badges that he was making.
It is one of my favourite things in the collection.
Yeah. It's rare that we get, that whole series of from start to finish.
As well as individual pieces of jewellery, the memorial has a kit in a tin box containing the bits and bobs needed to make the jewellery and some half-finished work.
What I'm holding here is a piece of shaped oval perspex that has had a RAF badge impressed into it. It was never finished. Later, the man who made it would have painted the eagle and the crown with some gold and red, and then maybe painted the background in another colour and put it into a special backing and maybe put a pin on it to make it a brooch.
And you've got some of these metal backings here as well, Di.
We have metal backings. We have almost the full kit. We have metal backings. We have pieces of perspex that are just cut into squares and rectangles, others that have been cut into ovals. And we actually have a RAF badge with an eagle and a crown set that would have been heated up and pressed into the perspex to make the jewellery.
So, George, how do you look after perspex?
Perspex is usually fairly stable. As long as we keep it out of strong light, it lasts quite a while. One of these little blue heart you mentioned earlier does have a problem, so I need to investigate that and find out what's going on. You can see that sort of condensation look on the front of it.
Yeah, that's why we can't see what's inside the perspex.
Yeah.
It's kind of bubbled.
It has. So I'll need to investigate that and find out what's going on. But I suspect it's probably a plasticizer, either from the paint they've used on the back or maybe from that piece of perspex is a different kind of plastic to the rest. But we'll look at that and we will probably analyse that deterioration with infrared spectroscopy and find out what's going on.
Do you think you'd be able to do anything about it?
We probably won't be able to restore it, but hopefully we'll be able to stop it getting worse.
And there's also a couple of rings here too that are made of perspex.
Yeah, so carved rings, and so they would have taken the piece of perspex and then basically carved the hole and then carved around the outside, and then again using, say, sand or whatever they had, polish it down until they got a really fine finish. So that's one of the things you notice about a lot of the perspex jewellery is they have an absolutely beautiful finish to them.
They look really modern too, I've got to say.
Well, that's the thing. Resin jewellery, acrylic jewellery is very in right now, and this actually would work quite well in current fashion.
They were so clever, so innovative, the men who made these.
They were, and they took something that was just rubbish, just leftover, pieces of damaged aircraft and other items, and they turned them into something beautiful.
What do you think, Di, when you look at this collection of jewellery? And we're just looking at a few pieces. You have a much more extensive collection with so many different stories, so many different items in the memorial.
I think of a lot of things, but mostly for the handmade items, the craftsmanship, and also that giving that little piece of yourself to someone that you love. For the items that were purchased, they often have symbolism and memories and importance and commemorate people.
Some symbolise hope, some symbolise loss, I suppose.
They do, and some turn from one to the other. There's something to remember a person while they're away and then they never come back and they become a memorial to them.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.